Hey, if you're new to this channel, welcome to Region Break. It's a show where we look at two versions of the same game from two different regions. And today, we're going to be doing Majora's Mask. The amount of changes in this game is really surprising. I didn't even cover all of them. I just grabbed the most interesting ones so we could show you them today. And we're going to start off with one of the most interesting changes that I've seen between both of these versions, and that is Skull Kid himself. So in the US version, he has a straw face. It's supposed to kind of look like how his limbs look and all that stuff. But in Japan, he has a pitch black face, which the localizers obviously saw as problematic due to a massive cultural shift that we had here in America, known as blackface. Something that persisted all the way up to the 2000s, but especially in old media, white Americans would dress themselves up in black makeup in order to portray harmful stereotypes towards African Americans. It became much more widely accepted even back then that blackface is considered incredibly harmful, and so people try to avoid any sort of depiction of that as much as humanly possible. And so as a result, this is what you see in Majora's Mask versus the US and the Japanese side. Now this next one, I have no clue why they would make this change, but the Pendant of Memories in the US version has its color entirely changed to blue for its gems, whereas in the original Japanese version, it was green on the 3D model, but there's a blue gem on the base of the model for the sprite. So maybe the model was changed completely due to the color inconsistency in the Japanese version, though that just raises even more questions, so it's kind of hard to decide what's going on here, what was really the thoughts behind this change. Anyways, moving on to the cows in the alien cutscene. When you're first told about the alien invasion, there's a cutscene that involves a cow, and for some reason in the Japanese version there is a nose ring, but for the US version there isn't. And why the heck would they make this change? There could be a sensitivity issue here that I'm not seeing, but there's also the possibility that in the US, nose rings are typically used for bulls and only sometimes used for cows. And so to kind of sell the point home that this is a cow, despite the fact that it's clearly udders on both of them, maybe they removed the nose ring for that reason. And then in this area of Clocktown, you might remember that there's a hidden chest with 100 rupees. Well, in the Japanese version, the chest was way closer to the walls, and the change that was made for the US version is probably because of the fact that in the Japanese version, there was chances that your character could get stuck or clip through walls. And then in the Skulltula House, there is this loft that is hidden up here, and you do need to go up here to get one gold Skulltula, but there are major differences between the two versions. First of all, the US version has a hookshot spot, whereas the Japanese version has a barrel. Not only does it have that one barrel to get up there, but it also has several more barrels, where in the US version, there are pots. The reason why this change was made was supposedly because the gold Skulltula could end up on top of one of the other barrels, and then when you would destroy that second barrel, it would float in the air, but I was never able to replicate this. It's just what's being told on sites like the Cutting Room Floor, which, by the way, big thank you to the Cutting Room Floor for providing a lot of information that was used in this episode. I'll have links to them in the video description down below. And then this one's an absolutely crazy change. When you first reunite with Epona, the cutscenes are completely different. For the US version, it shows Epona first, then it shows Link running towards Epona happily, excited to see his long-lost friend. Whereas in the Japanese version, it takes a very different approach where the camera starts off in the sky and swoops down in on Epona. The camera often lands in an angle where you can't even see Epona's face. I think that the change that was made in the US version is way better, but also just totally unnecessary and really surprising when you look at a 3D game like this. Speaking of incredibly surprising changes, in the gardens of the Deu Palace, there are tunnels and secret passages that were exclusive to the Japanese version. Doing a side-by-side comparison here will show you where all those tunnels start and end and how they were replaced in the US version, usually with rupees. But yeah, the inside of this tunnel that you're looking at right now, the Japanese version, was not used at all in the US version. There's also all sorts of torches and stuff that are placed completely differently between the two versions. Like for example, in the US version, there is a torch that is resting on top of this tree trunk, maybe just to hide the fact that that tree trunk already looks like a tunnel when it's not supposed to look like one. There was also one placed here in the US version next to this heart piece. Again, a really bizarre change that didn't really need to happen. Also, one thing I forgot to mention about the secret tunnels, they do have exits that are completely inaccessible to the US version. So this top of the hill here is only accessible by going through the tunnel in the Japanese version. Otherwise, you cannot access this geometry in the US version. Also, the tunnel that goes to the magic bean salesman, a necessary character, for whatever reason, has a completely different spot between the two versions. Here's where it is in the Japanese version. And here's where it is in the US version. And I'll tell you, the regional differences from Majora's Mask just doesn't slow down. Here we got another scene here with the pirate fortress, and you might notice that these two treasure chests are facing in opposite directions. There is a reason for this. The big reason is because in the Japanese version, there is a shortcut that you can go to that actually drops you down and then faces the treasure chest towards you. But since for whatever reason they decided to get rid of that shortcut in the US version, the treasure chest now faces towards the front entrance. Here's a side-by-side comparison about where that tunnel should be and where it's not in the US version. And here's another wild change. At the Great Bay, there is this raft here that leads up into one of the buildings, and you simply cannot climb up it in the Japanese version. This was changed for the US version so that you could get up there with regular old Link, but in the Japanese version, you had to jump out of the water as Zora Link in order to even get up there. I can see how that would be really freaking annoying. Speaking of Zora Link, there's this scene where you're supposed to bring Mikau to the shoreline, but in the original Japanese version, you could not grab onto Mikau. Instead, you had to push him, and there was a lot of problems that came with that. It was very easy to go off center and kind of slide off of Mikau while you were trying to push him, making this part really frustrating. Whereas in the US version, you just locked onto him essentially, and you were able to hold forward and get him to the shore really easily. Though there is one little funny thing about the US version that the Japanese version doesn't have as a result. You can pick up Mikau at a certain point, and it causes all sorts of weird, funny things. Like, for example, when I tried it out, Mikau got stuck underneath the environment, and I had to basically make this into a mini boundary break episode to show you where he ended up. Gotta say a big thank you to all the seagulls that made this an easy find. Now you can press switches to move those blocks around that you're seeing on the screen, but in the Japanese version, there's sort of like a Mickey Mouse ear thing going on with the patterns, whereas in the US version, it's a nice straight line. I assume this change was made because it makes it a lot easier to land on the other side at the end of this puzzle, whereas in the Japanese version, it might be easier to miss your jump. This one was a really good change for the US version. In the original Japanese version, if Link was to wear a mask or take off a mask, he sort of breaks the fourth wall and actually faces the camera after the animation is done. Whereas the US version retains the original position of Link regardless of if you put the mask on or not. Here's a neat little aesthetic change for you. The title screen for Majora's Mask in the US version is all purple, whereas in the Japanese version, the Legend of has sort of like a skin tone to it. Then the skin colored Japanese font says The Legend of Zelda, with the subtitle underneath it saying The Mask of Majora. Also, for whatever reason, the font between the Japanese version and the US version is skinnier in the Japanese side. Also, just a little bit smaller too. And also, get this, the Japanese version has 3 save files as opposed to the US version's 2. Now you might be thinking to yourself, why would they make a change that's worse for the US side? And the reason for that is because the US version is secretly the better version when it comes to memory management, because the US version is the only version that lets you actually use the owls to save your game. Yes, the owls are still available in the Japanese version of the game. However, you can't use the owls to save. Instead, you can only use it to fast travel, which, good God, I wouldn't imagine wanting to play this game without that feature. Also, here's a fun little change for you. Anytime it turns into noon or midnight, the number goes to 0 in the Japanese version, whereas in the US version, it goes to 12. But a change that is way more surprising than that is that on the third day, we all know in the US, they call it the final day, whereas in the Japanese version, they call it the last day. As you can see there on the bottom of the screen, it says final and last. I collected this footage on my Twitch stream, and one of my viewers had a really good guess as to why this change might have been made. The word last could imply to some players that aren't paying attention that we're on the first day instead of the third day, because you were on the second day, then you see that you're on the last day. So it could be misinterpreted as the last day instead of the final day, which is why it got changed to the final day. Also, a weird change with the Goron. If you collect rupees with the Goron mask, you could see that the text bubble is on the bottom in the US side and on the top in the Japanese side, allowing you to see a lot more of the body in the US side, whereas in the Japanese side, they just barely get his head into frame. And here's an audio change for you. Skull Kid does this ear-piercing scream here. Now, in the Japanese side, the sound of Skull Kid screaming is intrinsically linked to the Skull Kid model, so when the camera shifts, you can just hear the sound go really quiet, really fast. This was not intentional. Although the sound is coming out of Skull Kid, which is accurate, the director didn't want the sound to just shift like that when it moved the camera. So instead, in the US side, the sound is linked to the world. And so if the camera moves around, the volume of Skull Kid's scream will just remain the same regardless of where it goes. For the Song of Double Time, there's actually a big difference here. When you finish playing the song, in the US side, it fades to black. However, in the Japanese side, it immediately tells you what day and time it is. Here's something a little bit interesting for you. On the select item screen, obviously in the US side it says select item, but with the Japanese version you can see the letter C, which means that it has to say something different. In the Japanese side, it says C item. Also, the Deku mask in the US side has a different name in the Japanese side. It is Deku Nutsu mask, which translates to Deku Nut mask. Also, a weird little change with the Deku mask when you're wearing it. If you have no items equipped, there is a transparency for the C buttons in the US version, but there is full opacity for the Japanese side for some reason. And here's a really weird teeny tiny change that I noticed. This cutscene where you're supposed to get a story from the Happy Mask salesman shows that with this one little scene with Skull Kid, you have the option to push the button to continue the dialogue in the US version, whereas in the Japanese version, it just continues whether or not you're ready or not. And what's weird about this in particular is that any other bubble of dialogue for this sequence also matches with the Japanese side, where you're not allowed to push a button to continue the dialogue. It just goes on its own. Also, one little funky change that I just wanted to show you is that in the Japanese version, if you were to make a brand new file, you can see that the only thing that it shows you is the death counter. Whereas with the US side, it shows you how many heart pieces you have left till you get another heart, how many rupees you have, and how many masks you collected. If you're brand new here, I have a playlist that has other Zelda games that have been region broken, I guess. That to say that there are other episodes of Region Break with Zelda games. And if you've been here for a while and you want to support me in a big way, I got a third channel where I'm finally just talking about news or just editorial type stuff that's about the game industry. It's called She Says the News. I'm going to have a link to it on the screen as well as in the video description for both those things if you're interested in either. Either way, I really appreciate you spending your time with me today, and take care.